This is a course about using flash, but I think it's a good idea to first acknowledge the benefits and the downsides of using other types of lighting. Let's start with natural light.
A lot of us love working with natural light, and that's because you can get great results with it, and sometimes it's the best light for the job. But the downside, natural light can be hard to control. Basically because you've got one main light source, the sun, and you can't control its position. And that position's always changing. Maybe slowly, but it's never in exactly the same place for more than a few minutes, especially earlier or later in the day. Sunlight can also be harsh. It can create a lot of contrast, and depending on how you use it, it can be very unflattering to your subject. Don't get me wrong, I've got nothing against natural outdoor lighting. I'm just saying it can be a challenge to work with. Look, I'd consider myself a pretty competent portrait photographer, but there have definitely been times when I would have preferred to get out from under the sun and into a studio. It can be hard to get a pleasing portrait on a really bright sunny day, especially if you don't have something to shade or help block the direct sunlight. Now, if you're working with natural light under certain conditions, like indoors with window light, or otherwise out of the direct sunlight, the results can be pretty amazing. You can also get great controlled lighting with constant light sources, like hot lights or fluorescent lighting. The benefits are that you can usually control the effect and position of the light, and you can see the effect of the light you're working with in real time. When you're working with flash or strobe lighting, the duration of the light is so short, you can't see the effect and make adjustments the same way that you can with constant light.
So why don't we just use constant light instead of flash for our portraits? Well, there are a couple of reasons.
For one, compared to flash units, constant lights aren't very powerful. And what that means is you'll have to make up for the lower powered lights with your camera settings. Potentially, that calls for a higher ISO and will result in more noise in your images. Maybe more importantly, when you're using more powerful constant light sources, they tend to get very hot. And this can not only be dangerous, potentially causing burns or even a fire, but the heat and constant bright light can also make your subject uncomfortable. Still, under the right conditions, constant lighting can have its advantages over natural light or even flash.
Okay, so we've acknowledged the pros and cons of using natural light and artificial constant light. But let's get back to what we're here for, and that's flash.
Eventually, most photographers realize that there are incredible benefits to using flash, and we're going to talk about how to get great results with your flash mounted directly to your camera, and then get into using that same flash away from the camera. Now, this is where a whole new world of photography opens up for us. For portrait photography, using off-camera, studio-type setups with our flash units is really a game changer. What's great is that with a little understanding, it's pretty easy to get professional-looking results with these flash units that were designed to slip onto the hot shoe of your camera. As a matter of fact, you can get the look of real studio portraiture with your Canon or Nikon flash units, or really any good flash. You just have to know how.
Before we move on to the type of flash units we'll be working with, let's quickly go over another type of flash lighting. Now, you're probably aware that flash lighting isn't just available with shoe mount flash units.
Studio lighting traditionally involves high-powered monoblocks or power pack-driven strobe heads. This type of studio lighting has many advantages over the average speed light. Studio strobes provide high output, and good ones feature modeling lamps, good recycling time, and they allow you to use lighting accessories and modifiers. But they usually require a plug-in power supply, and even if you have a battery-driven system, these setups tend to be much larger and heavier than speed lights. Now, if you have someone to help carry your gear from one place to another, studio strobes can definitely be used on location. Again, you'll probably need some external power source. That means large battery packs, AC power, or some photographers bring their own gas-powered generators to provide the power for their lights. Studio strobes in their slightly smaller location versions aren't cheap, but they are great to work with if you have the budget and you don't mind dealing with the extra weight and power requirements.
When I started doing editorial portraiture, I was a one-man show, and I definitely liked to get in and get out as fast as possible. I needed to come up with a way to get good lighting for my portraits without having to deal with the weight and bulk of big lights. So after a little experimentation with my speed lights, I knew they were all I needed to get most jobs done. I realized that using speed lights for portraiture isn't anything new, but it was definitely new to me, and I have to admit I was a little unsure if I could get good portraits without my big lights, and I also wondered what people would say when I showed up with my little speed lights. The thing was, no one ever seemed to notice or care about what type of lights I was using. And here's a little piece of advice. As long as it looks like you're comfortable and confident with your gear, people are going to trust you with your process. They won't care about how you get the job done as long as they're happy with the results.
I stress simplicity when it comes to photography, and the setup I use most often fits with that philosophy. My location setup consists of a basic compact light stand, umbrella adapter, shoot-through umbrella, radio trigger, and some connectors. I bring 2 of these rigs with me on a typical shoot, and most of it stays assembled and ready to go. Setup takes just a couple of minutes, and I already know the flash and camera settings I'll start off with, so I'm ready to start a portrait session very soon after I arrive at the location.
Now we're going to get into multi-light setups later in the course, but this module is about getting amazing portraits with one on-camera flash, and that's a topic we're going to cover first. In this section, we're going to cover the basics of using your camera and flash in typical indoor environments. Now, you should already be familiar with the basic operation of your DSLR. This includes knowing how to change exposure modes, like switching from P mode over to Aperture Priority or Manual mode. Knowing how to adjust your exposure settings, like ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. We're also going to cover some other adjustment controls, specifically exposure compensation and flash exposure compensation. Now, if you're not familiar with them, it's best to stop here and look at your camera manual and learn these functions, or at least learn how to access them, then come back to this video. We're going to start with a few basics. Now, keep in mind that not every DSLR and flash system work the same way, but you'll get the idea as we go. We'll start by making sure you have the right type of flash unit for what we're going to do. For our purposes, any on-camera flash unit you're using needs to have a swiveling and rotating head for the best on-camera versatility. If it doesn't, you can continue on, but be on the lookout for a flash with this feature. It'll really make a difference for you. Next, the flash should be compatible with your camera system's TTL capabilities. It can't just be any camera and any brand or type of TTL. They have to be the kind that work together properly. If you're not sure that your DSLR and flash unit are compatible in this way, you need to look up the documentation to make sure. If they aren't compatible on a TTL level, you can continue to watch the rest of this section, but it won't apply to your current flash. That's okay, because once we get to off-camera flash, you can continue with what you have. Generally, here's how we want to set up our on-camera TTL compatible flash unit for indoor portraits. First, we make sure the flash is secured to the flash shoe and that it and the camera are powered on. Next, the flash should be set to TTL mode. See your flash's documentation for instructions on how to set it to this mode if you don't already know how. And if your flash has HSS capability, that's high-speed sync, you might as well switch that on, and it'll only kick on if you need it. Otherwise, your flash is going to fire normally for most of your shots. Generally speaking, the camera should be in manual mode for indoor photography, but other modes can also give you good results. And as a matter of fact, having your camera in fully automatic mode, and that would be the P mode on up to the auto or green mode, those will give you excellent results most of the time. Those fully automatic modes won't, however, give you as much control as you'd probably like, and since we're here to learn how to best control your flash for portrait lighting, we're going to stick to manual mode on your camera for now. Set your ISO to a low rating, maybe its lowest rating, or something in that range. ISO 100 to 200 is good. Whatever you set it at, try to keep it consistent as you continue to get familiar with using flash. Set your shutter speed to the fastest camera to flash sync speed. Again, check your documentation for your camera if you don't know what its flash sync speed is. On my camera, it's 1/250th of a second. It's a good idea to set your white balance to flash. If you're shooting in RAW mode, which you should be doing most of the time, white balance can always be adjusted later when you upload your images to your computer. But I like to set it to flash on the camera so I get a better idea of what the colors will look like on the preview screen. The last main setting to deal with is aperture. I like to use something like f4 or f5.6. Now, we've just set up our camera with manual settings, so why is the flash set to TTL if our camera is on manual mode? Well, that's because we want our on-camera flash output to adjust automatically for us based on the changes that might affect flash exposure. And most importantly, this includes the changes in distance from our flash to our subject. Even slight changes in distance are probably going to require changes to flash power. TTL automatically manages flash output for us. Just to make this clear, it's the distance between our flash and the subject that affect flash exposure. The distance between the camera and the subject don't really matter. But since the flash is attached to the camera and the camera to subject distance can change, that means the flash to subject distance can change. Again, with every change in distance, flash output has to change, and TTL takes care of that automatically. You could use manual flash control in this scenario, but every time the distance between the camera flash and your subject changes, you'll have to change the flash output manually. Take test shots and then hope nothing changed right before you took the next picture. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we can safely use manual flash when the flash units are positioned away from the camera and the subject stays in one place. In that case, the subject to lighting distance stays the same, even if our camera moves around. So, the flash units, or whatever lighting you're using, can be set to manual and the settings won't have to change from shot to shot. Okay, so now we've got our flash on the camera, our camera is set to manual mode, we've got our settings locked in, and our flash is on TTL, virtually ensuring we get good flash exposures. Everything should work well at this point. But what if TTL isn't giving us the flash output we need? What if the automatic flash control isn't set up for the type of picture that we want to take? TTL is pretty good at figuring out flash exposure, but it's not perfect for every situation. I'll give you a couple of extreme examples. Let me explain what's happening here. TTL is good at working out a flash exposure for a typical scene. And by typical, I mean something with different tones, including some brighter and some darker tones. But really, the middle tones are what automatic exposure meters and TTL try to target. If your scene has mostly middle tones, you're good to go, because TTL wants to put out enough light to expose for those middle tones correctly. That's its aim. Now, if you shoot a scene with mostly bright tones in it, like a white dress against a white wall, TTL wants to capture the scene to faithfully represent what it assumes are middle tones. So it tries to make the scene appear middle-toned, not bright white. Consequently, TTL lowers the flash power and we get a darker scene than we should. In the same way that TTL erroneously tries to correct for bright scenes, it usually pushes out too much light in darker scenes. It tries to expose black to reproduce as a middle tone, and now black looks more gray than black. Really, that means that the scene is overexposed. In each case, the flash needs to be told to put out a different amount of light than TTL thinks it should. We need a way to override the automatic output of TTL. We need a way to tell the flash to pump out more light with the white dress scene and less light with the black dress scene. We could take over control of the flash by switching to manual flash control, but then we lose the advantage of TTL. And we don't want to do that because TTL at least gets us in the ballpark for our exposures. So when TTL is not quite getting the flash output right, we need a way to override its decision without losing the advantage of automatic flash. The way we override TTL flash output is with a control called Flash Exposure Compensation, or FEC. This is usually controlled with a simple dial on the camera. Dial it up for more light than TTL is giving us, dial it down for less. There's another control on the camera simply called Exposure Compensation. Think of this as similar to flash exposure compensation, but its main job is to adjust the camera's overall exposure of a scene, not just the flash. But right now we're going to stick with using flash exposure compensation when working with on-camera flash. We've covered the basics of setting up on-camera flash and TTL. Next, we're going to talk about on-camera modifiers. When your flash fires, it produces a very short but powerful burst of light. The light's emitted from a small flash tube and it comes out of the flash head through a lens on the front. You can see this means our light source is no larger than about the size of a business card. We know that a small light source relative to your subject gives you more contrast. A lot of contrast gives us the look of harsh lighting, which is something we often try to avoid on our subjects, especially with the main light. The goal is usually a more natural or pleasing contrast, generally referred to as softer light. In order to get this kind of light, we need a larger light source relative to our subject, and it wouldn't hurt to have some fill light in the mix. There are different ways to achieve both of these things. Now, even though this section is about on-camera flash modifiers, I want to explain the idea of bouncing your flash off a wall, because with a lot of modifiers, we're trying to accomplish kind of the same thing. We're trying to get the look of softer light by creating a larger light source for our subject. My favorite way to do this with on-camera flash is just to point the flash at some large light-colored surface, like a wall. And this way, the wall becomes the main light for the subject. And since a wall is much bigger than the direct flash source, we get a softer, less contrasty light. As a bonus, the light tends to bounce off of other surfaces in the room too. It comes back in toward the subject from different angles, and it often gives us some nice fill light. One popular type of modifier is a piece of plastic that fits over the flash head. It disperses light in different directions, widening the spread of the beam coming out of the flash head. This doesn't actually emit softer light. What it does is help throw the light out to the surrounding walls and ceiling. And this gives the light a chance to bounce back toward the subject from different angles, reducing contrast. And that's what gives us the look of softer light. Variations on the basic bounce card help to create a larger initial light source where the subject is concerned. Again, here is what the initial light source would be. But you put a bounce card on it and configure it like this, and the reflective light off the flash is now about 3 or 4 times larger. But the added benefit is that the flash head is also directing a lot of light onto the ceiling. That light bounces back down and around the room, again, reducing contrast. And there are lots of commercial and do-it-yourself versions of diffusers and bounce modifiers available. I think the simplest solutions are often the best, but it never hurts to experiment with other options when you have the time. There are also softboxes available for on-camera flash units, and the idea behind a softbox is to create a larger light source than the flash head produces on its own. Of course, the softbox directs all that light forward, so while the light source is a few times bigger than the flash, it's still relatively small and it's directed straight ahead. It's not made to spread light around the room, which we know helps reduce contrast for that pleasing softer light. I like using these on small subjects, like for close-up work, because it works more like a real softbox that way. Okay, we've covered the basic modifiers for on-camera flash. Later in the course, we'll talk about the types of modifiers we use for off-camera flash setups. These are usually umbrellas and larger softboxes. For now, let's continue our discussion of on-camera flash and see how we can use it to create some really nice portraits. In our previous videos, we covered the basics of setting up your camera and flash for on-camera flash portraits, and talked about some of the modifiers available for on-camera flash. In this section, we're going to get into some of my favorite on-camera flash techniques. Let's start by reviewing the type of camera and flash settings we'll use for indoor portraits. Start by setting your flash to TTL mode, set your camera to manual mode, and use a reasonable ISO. Next, use the fastest normal sync speed for your flash. Finally, use the widest aperture that your lens will allow that works for you. The reason I say this is because some lenses lose sharpness at their widest apertures. Once you've determined your settings, make it a point to always start with the same ones. With your default settings in place, you'll be all set when you walk into a room. Your camera and flash will be ready to go, and you should get good results. Okay, even though we're using TTL, we still need some way to control our flash when it's not giving us the output we want. We want to control the look of the ambient light in the room too. We've got 2 controls on our camera that can make doing all of this really easy. That's flash exposure compensation and shutter speed. And these should be the main controls that we use if we need to make any adjustments. We'll use the flash exposure compensation dial if we determine we need more or less power from our flash for a given shot. Adjust the shutter speed if we want more or less ambient light to show up in a scene. If you take a couple of shots and notice you'd like to have a little more warmth or ambient light appear in the photos, that's easy. Just dial your shutter speed down to 1/60th of a second. Want more ambient light to show up? Try 1/40th or 1/15th. Just ride your shutter speed dial up or down to get the ambient lighting to look the way you want it to. Of course, there's something important to keep in mind here. As the shutter speed gets slower, you might encounter more blur in your shots, and this is going to be blur produced by the recording of motion under the ambient light. If you're being creative with blur effects, that's fine. It's all up to you and that one little shutter speed dial. Okay, we've discussed how to control the look of ambient light in the room. Let's talk about controlling the light produced by the flash. If you need to make any adjustments to the amount of light you're getting from the flash, that's when you use FEC, flash exposure compensation. You won't need it often, but if your subject is wearing light colors, you might have to dial the FEC up a bit, otherwise your camera might underexpose the shot. If your subject's wearing dark colors, you might have to dial the FEC down to compensate for the camera attempting to overexpose a shot. Now, your camera controls the flash output based on what it thinks the best exposure is going to be. So sometimes you have to force it to accept more or less light from your flash to get things to look right. All right, to wrap this part up, for indoor shots, we've got the magic bullet now. Establish your default settings for your gear and always start with those same settings. That way you don't have to think about it and you don't have to start from square one every time you're faced with shooting indoors with on-camera flash. Other than that, just ride the shutter speed and sometimes the flash exposure compensation dials, and you're good to go. Let's get right to it and start with the simplest and most straightforward use of flash, direct flash. While direct, straight-on flash is something many photographers try to avoid, it's not always a bad idea. It has a look to it that suggests a certain urgency, and you can use this look to quickly create a no-frills portrait or use it for effect, for example, for a photo booth effect. So don't write this one off because it can really come in handy sometimes. In my opinion, this is the single most effective way to create the look of beautiful window light or softbox style portraits with just a wall and an on-camera flash unit. Just use a light-colored wall to bounce your light onto your subject. Now, if you've got other light-colored walls and the ceiling working for you, all the better, because of the pleasing natural bounce you'll get from all the surfaces in varying degrees of illumination. I suggest you find a sweet spot that works for you, and I'm talking about your position and your subject's distance and orientation to the wall. Always start there and just adjust as you see fit. This technique is really versatile because you can get everything from very dramatic split lighting to soft, even illumination. The subject's orientation and the additional bounce that you're going to get off of walls for fill light are really the key. Use a small flag on your flash if you'd like to control the amount of direct light your subject's receiving. You can also bounce flash against the wall and ceiling behind you to fill a small room with beautiful light. This is especially useful in fluid situations or anytime you've got one or more people who aren't necessarily interacting with the camera. This technique can be very handy. Using a relatively light-colored part of the room, like a wall and ceiling combination, turn the flash around and aim it about 45 degrees up to bounce fill the room full of scattered soft light. I find that this technique works well with a wide-angle lens and when the flash is positioned far enough from the wall to allow for a broad bounce. The thing you want to watch out for when doing a portrait with this technique, make sure you bounce the flash high behind you or angled so you don't block the light from reaching your subject as it bounces back toward her. If you don't have a nearby wall to bounce light off of, and this happens in larger rooms, you can just use a reflector or a white foam core panel as your bounce surface. And while we're talking about bounce, you could simply attach a bounce surface to your flash in the form of a traditional bounce card. Here, I'm cutting one out of a piece of white crafting foam. I attach the bounce card to my flash like this, and I use it this way for horizontal shots and this way for vertical shots. This keeps the light source up high rather than to the side or below the subject. The bounce card is a great little tool, and sometimes it's the best one to have, especially when wall bounce isn't available. Now here are some examples of using straight flash and some of the other modifiers we discussed. In this module, we've covered some really effective ways to create beautiful portraits with a single on-camera flash. With some experimentation, you'll start to zero in on the best camera and flash settings for your setup. And with a little practice, you'll develop an instinct for how and when to use direct flash, bounce flash, or modifiers.